Good day and welcome back everyone to Frontlines and Faultlines with Mike Kelly. Great to have you back with us to finish off our conversation about the historical underpinnings to modern attitudes, politics and objectives of the Chinese Communist Party and its leadership, in particular Xi Jinping, who's really the sole man at the helm these days. So how did we get to that? And we talked a lot about the Mao era and the unassailable stranglehold that he had on China. And that was followed, of course, by a bit of a period of instability, not of the kind we'd seen in the past, but there's a lot of contest going on internally in the Chinese Communist Party at the time, and, you know, little sort of blips in the stability image that portraying in relation to the so-called Gang of Four, etc. But during this time, you started to see leadership structures and control mechanisms put in place to very much control the process of rotating leadership in the Communist Party, and to not go through what they'd gone through in the past under the strict authoritarian control of Mao Zedong and the effects of things like the Cultural Revolution. A lot of these people who were surviving through into the new groupings at the helms had bad experiences during that time and wanted to avoid it. And also had sort of a different attitude towards the West in many ways. And Zhou Enlai was a really good example of that. Two particularly dominant figures in sort of a different basis for engaging with the West at this time. So he was the Premier of the People's Republic of China from September 54 till he died in 1976. And he'd had some rough times during the Cultural Revolution himself, personally. But this period was actually well regarded by the West and by China in many ways. He had been the foreign minister between 49 and 58. And at this point in time, during that period, he was very much advocating a peaceful coexistence with the West to basically rebuild the basis for a relationship after the Korean War, rapprochement with the US, really trying to respect the rules-based international order and the UN frameworks as a way of providing China with a phase where its interests could be protected before it achieved the sort of economic and military dominance that it had ambitions to achieve, where it's still, you know, considered to be a little bit vulnerable during this time, even though it did have nuclear weapons. So its ability to project power wasn't to reach the heights that it has now for a long time. So the attitude was, yeah, let's reinforce the rules-based order and promote the theories of non-intervention and respect for sovereignty, etc., to basically put up the stiff arm to, don't you have a conversation with us about our human rights? You know, that's interference, etc. And but the carrot associated with that was a better economic and political relationship with the West. So in the 1954 Geneva Conference and the 1995 Bandung Conference, Zhou Enlai really managed to steer a different path and helped orchestrate Richard Nixon's 1972 visit to China, and the so-called ping-pong diplomacy went into full bloom. And this was very useful for the United States because it, at the same time, created a degree of separation between China and the Soviet Union. That sort of block of threat was particularly concerning, and really there was a bit of a distancing between Soviet Union and China at this time. And so, you know, there were policies that conveniently managed and cauterized or compartmentalized the disputes that China had with the United States, for example, over Taiwan, and the Soviet Union, the issues that they had with the Soviet Union, managing to balance, you know, an improved relationship with the US at the same time as maintaining a certain level of relationship with the Soviet Union without sort of forcing them to act more aggressively against China. And of course, surrounding them, India, Korea, and Vietnam as well. So it was quite creative and quite constructive in that phase, and showed a lot of promise. And that was built on by this other great figure of that period of time, or that approach to the world, in Deng Xiaoping. A bit of a light and dark experience, though, with Deng Xiaoping, as we'll consider. But he became the paramount leader through these processes that were evolving to manage changes of leadership in a ordered way. And he really did influence and build on that the experience of Zhou Enlai, and added his own flair to that. And you started seeing the ability of people to leave China and study in the West. And he really wanted to sort of draw in the knowledge and the advancement that he could get from the West, and look to build the Chinese economy. He realized that China couldn't stand as a world power of significance without building a strong economy, and the potential he recognized was there for China to be, if not the dominant economic power in the world, then certainly right up there, competing for that status. So his ambitions were met with practical measures that he put in place to try and overcome those gaps in technology and education, etc., and industrial capability. So the Communist Party principles, in theory, didn't change, but you started to see a bit of a loosening of the belt straps here. So over that time, those things started to actually pay off. We did start seeing a bit of an echo of the self-strengthening movement, but done in a way that didn't result in the weaknesses that achieved for the Qing dynasty. So what did those look like? So you started to actually see a kind of a market economy building here, and there's the famous phrase that China was socialism with a Chinese face. And it really meant quite a turn away from many aspects of communism. And foreign investment starts to come in this time too. They're encouraging this sense of stability, the fact that we're open for business and we want to learn from you, etc. So a lot of capital, technology and expertise is starting to come into China, and you really now start to see the engine grinding into motion that creates the massive economy and dynamic that we now know that we have with us today. And the dynamics of international trade associated with that. That really is the key underpinning here. What was built was a capacity to really insinuate China into world trade to the extent where trade drove that massive economic growth particularly. And I really think that's a point to hammer home that's important in conversations with China, and realizations that probably need to be underlined as we have conversations going forward, that their strength and power has arisen through international trade, their standing in the world. It's quite interesting through this period, you see the beginnings of a transformation, so that a lot of the production capacity in the West starts to move to China, and in fact to some other locations in Southeast Asia and Asia. And the evolution of what comes to be described as the smile curve. So the West continues to dominate even today in the design and the marketing phase of the production process, the marketing process. But the smile factor in the smile curve is the technological advancement that China and other countries, but particularly China, achieved in production processes, which was something that we in the West actually fell behind in. And so we lost our capabilities and edge in technology and production process, and maintain them in design and marketing. So this process is the start of that evolution, beginning here during this Deng Xiaoping period. But it's also doing a great deal of good for Chinese people, to be completely honest and open about this. You had a country that, of extreme poverty at one point in time, of really terrible standards of living in many pockets, and most pockets, in fact, of the country, subsistence living, a very tough life that's starting to now rise. You're starting to see this tide rise across the country where jobs are available, and then there's the beginning of the famous shift between the country to the cities associated with this in many ways. But that, is kind of the building of the unwritten social contract in China as well, that, yeah, all right, we'll remain happy as long as our conditions and our living standards continue to rise and we look to do better. And it's kind of a reflection of the Confucian kind of ideology in the background of the Chinese culture, which is you respect hierarchy until the hierarchy is no longer good. And then, you can respond. It's permitted to respond to a hierarchy that's turned bad or evil or whatever, but deserving of respect until that point in time, reflected in attitudes in relation to the family as well and patriarchy. So this private enterprise creates millions of jobs and really does lift the standards for many Chinese. So that social contract, starts to be underlined as to the lack of any political agitation of any significance during this period. And other standards rise as well in relation to healthcare and education. So this is all going very well until we get to the point where it's a bit like Maslow's hierarchy of needs that we talked about before, where, as you get your basic needs met, then you start moving your expectation meter up to what the next thing is that you would like to see. And so, start to see people hankering for more freedom politically associated with their better living standards, right? Oh, great, now I can eat, now I can do things, now I have a job, but I'd also like to have some political freedom now. I'd like free speech, etc. And a little more freedom about the things I can do, actually, as well. And so that results in the pro-democracy movement leading up to the 1989 Tiananmen Square situation, driven largely by Chinese students. And I think at this time, too, you've got Hong Kong sitting over there on the periphery, which is showing this, booming economy and a really prominent situation for a small piece of real estate in the world, with people enjoying democratic freedoms and real close proximity example of what the art of the possible might be for Chinese people, and it can succeed. So, this push starts in 1989. However, and of course, this is something that's now appearing in the international media. People are following this very closely. People are actually feeling, oh, is this the new turning here? Are we going to see, a fantastic transition in China, and this will be even better? We have the beginnings of a democracy. And of course, no doubt there was and as we know now, there were quite a lot of energetic and emotive debates within the Chinese leadership about how best to deal with this. But in the end, the default position in China in this period of time since the end of the Second World War is that you have to come in with a heavy hand on anything that looks like it might send you into a spiral of internal discohesion of a process that might easily slide into fragmentation again. China's such a vulnerable society to fragmentation with all its various fault lines, linguistically, ethnically, that it can't be governed any other way than with an iron hand. And so the decision's made to go in hard, and they went in hard with, as we know, tanks and the PLA coming in. That's supposed to be the People's Liberation Army, and up until this point, there actually was a lot of emphasis placed on their relationship and respect for the PLA. And now you've got the PLA being used as an implement to kill their own people on a large scale and repress them. So, that's a real moment for a different experience of the PLA for the Chinese people. So this is the constant tension that you have in our ambitions for China. This really set things back. It was to recover slightly, and the Deng Xiaoping trajectory continued, but obviously a serious setback for any ambitions to see, the creation of a Chinese democracy. So, now we've set this trajectory. Let's see how that then matures into what we see now in this absolute global economic powerhouse that's matched also by an increasingly imposing and impressive military capability, which is also very disturbing. So we've seen the return of Hong Kong in 1997, and this is now the beginning of the real test for China as to how it manages this situation. And they've come up with this concept of one country, two systems. So they're flagging that, yeah, we're going to let Hong Kong continue to enjoy what they've grown up with in terms of political freedom of speech, etc., the ability to be creative and have free-flowing thoughts and a free education, free from constraint, that is, in terms of ideology and what they could and couldn't learn. So this is now the beginning of that big experiment. And obviously, in those first few years, it seems to chug along quite satisfactorily. There's a limited degree of interference from mainland China into Hong Kong. And really, this is very significant, because if mainland China could demonstrate that it could achieve this one country, two systems outcome, then it would encourage Taiwan to believe that you could also reintegrate with the motherland, and it could end up being a one country, three systems. And you would be allowed to retain your freedoms that in time, perhaps, the dynamics of Hong Kong and Taiwan could potentially influence perhaps the evolution of mainland China itself to move towards this kind of outcome. So this was, I think, the hope that certainly a lot in the West were looking to see out of that experience, that this process of absorbing Hong Kong can demonstrate that this can be done without achieving or resulting in a disintegration of China, the lack of coherence and commitment to the general Chinese proposition, the Chinese chauvinist element that the Chinese Communist Party would like to maintain and foster. But at the same time, of course, it's associated with China's economic integration with the globe entirely. So we're starting to see that as part of the greater development of globalization, and where economies become interdependent, where widgets will be made of componentry for various final products in different locations around the world, and we're starting to see the belief that that's a good thing. That interdependence will mean there can't be conflict, that we'll all be joined at the hip, and that this will lend itself to general benefits and improvements in the world as a whole. So as part of that, China is admitted into the World Trade Organization, which is also an encouraging step, because you fall within the management regimes and processes of the World Trade Organization, which are meant to prohibit or prevent unequal competition or illegal actions within the colloquial sense of the way you manage your trade situation, the way you manage your tariff regimes, and all the rest of it. So, and that accession to the World Trade Organization did accelerate trade growth during that initial phase, and associated with that was the payoff for China of a surge in foreign investment. So a lot of companies, big global companies, looking to relocate or locate significant production capabilities within China. And you begin to see a Congo line in that respect, from Tesla to Apple to many others as well, and really starts to turbocharge that Chinese economic growth. And it gets to the point where China is able to showcase all this to the world and create a positive vibe with the 2008 Beijing Olympics, and Olympics that Australia assisted greatly with. And we come to that point where it is important to note that Australia, with its support of the Chinese Communist government during the Whitlam years, to recognise that and move away from the sorts of attitudes that had been in existence prior to that, in terms of prioritising a relationship with the nationalists and not wanting to acknowledge the Chinese Communist government. That step helped to build a relationship and engagement that looked quite positive, and has been quite positive in many moments and points in time. And our belief that we could influence China to the better, and that the economic relationship between Australia and China would be massively mutually beneficial. And certainly you saw the growth of the market relationship between the two countries did reflect well for Australia. And as Chinese living standards grew and their middle class grew, then you've got the potential for a massive market there for Australian goods. And you start to see the rise of opportunities in the Chinese marketplace for Australian goods like wine in particular, but many other things too. So, and Chinese tourism starts to become a very big factor in Australia in these years through to the Olympics and following. So this is kind of really a bit of a symbol of their emergence on the world stages, and perhaps also kind of trying to position themselves as a global leader morally, as well as something that, well, now you can accept that China's positive influence on the world. We've helped to lift all your economies. Don't hassle us, we're on a trajectory, but you can rely on us to be there to support the global order, etc., and to help you uplift yourself at the same time. So, it was just flagging that China was still committed to international cooperation, etc. So this brings us to this point where, we start to summarize where we are now, what shapes Chinese thinking. And it's really important to understand how heavily China relates to the past, to history. They draw on the deep thousands of years of Chinese civilization, which is a massive source of pride. All of the things they've achieved and the cultural achievements and depth and impressiveness is something that is a source of huge pride for the Chinese. And effectively, this can be exploited to create a Chinese chauvinism or nationalism that will sometimes be used and has been used, and particularly in recent times, to effectively mobilize the Chinese diaspora and the Chinese community at home to put up with impositions and loss of freedoms and sacrifice in order for the greater achievement and success of the Chinese nation. So what are the key elements of all of that, to summarize again? So we talked about the century of humiliation. Chinese have never forgotten the way that European powers treated them, the disrespect and the racism aspect of it, that the belief of the Europeans was that the Chinese were inferior, and certainly during that imperial period, that was a very common view of the Europeans. So they were aware of that, and they were aware of the way the Europeans treated them, imposing treaties on them, imposing territorial acquisitions, and really undermining Chinese society through the drug wars, etc. So then the other really significant thing is just the huge disruption, the huge loss of life, the huge setbacks suffered by China through all of its internal conflicts, its civil wars, the period of the warlords, and it just, all of those fault lines are there as far as they're concerned, and it wouldn't take much for them to slide back into some situation of ungovernability. And around the world, they watched other countries fall back on ethno-nationalisms with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the disintegration of places like Yugoslavia. So the lessons were learned there that, okay, we have to keep that tight iron grip on this country. There's no other way to govern a country like China with the size of its population and the diversity of it. It's a very solid point of agreement in the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party in general. Even though, as we'll talk about in the future, there may be different attitudes to the way China's management and leadership now is being conducted, and the structures that were put in place to see organised transitions having been dismantled. So, but there's still that firm belief in the strong hand on the tiller. So then, we talked about their security concerns. They just, this deep cultural memory of the suffering they endured under the Japanese and the humiliation there of having the Japanese heel at their neck, and the sorts of violence that the general Chinese population suffered at the hands of the Japanese at the time. And so, when you see the post-war period and you get the Korean War, they're then sort of casting this in that light of, oh, again, we've got those Europeans out there trying to sort of pressurize and encircle us and dictate to us. And, they're sort of waving the nuclear weapon at us, they, really lifting their noses at us because they're technically superior, etc. So that being an existential threat, if we don't have nuclear weapons, we've got to really surge on this and make sure we are, impervious to the threats of security, the impositions that can be created by not having the ability to stand up for yourself. Your negotiating power suffers as a result in every field. So, that's a really significant element to the security element, the fact that China is never going to be forced to kowtow to anybody again, and that, in fact, maybe it should be the other way around, that there should be an acceptance of the superiority of Chinese culture and its right for the number one place on the world stage, and the ability to kind of impose their will too on other countries in respect of the attitudes that we have and how we should deal with them. And it's really also important, we've talked about the Confucian aspect and the respect for hierarchy, etc., and traditions in society. The other aspect is that we often think of life in terms of games like chess, which is focused on a center of gravity on the king, etc., and maneuvering to that point. Whereas the Chinese have their game of Wei Qi, some of the places called Go, and this doesn't have that center of gravity concept, and it's very influential in the way the Chinese think of things and how they respond to threats like the Korean War, like the Japanese. And so it's a game effectively of slow strangulation of your opponent, and you build up multiple pressure points through these many counters you have. There'll be, each opponent will have 180 or 181 stones, as they call them, or counters. And you've got to see the whole board as part of this game. And it's really a question of outmaneuvering and developing your pressure points. And that is how the Chinese really view the world today. And the relationships that China forms are partly designed to rent a greater array of pressure points to bring to bear to pursue their objectives and their policy and their influence. And then, of course, some other traditions that they refer to is there's the famous stories, the novels of the Three Kingdoms, really is a source that they draw on for understanding human behavior and strategy and perceptions, but also the doctrines of Sun Tzu, doctrines like, the acme of success is to win without fighting. So this is the dilemma you have, is to interpret whether the Chinese are really serious, for example, and whether they would resort to military force to bring Taiwan back to the fold, or whether they just want to give that impression, and create all these other pressure points that, okay, you agree for this to happen in a peaceful way, then, there'll be big payoffs for that economically and in terms of peace and the lack of the horrendous impact that would occur in the case of a full-scale war. So these are the dynamics I think it's really important to understand when you're considering China, and also to encourage us to look for ways to build bridges of understanding. That's very tough in the situation of the situation that Xi Jinping has created, but part of where they are now is driven by their absolute paranoia about energy security in particular, and it's sort of reminiscent in some ways of how World War II began, in that Japan decided to start surging to Southeast Asia in order to secure their energy resources, their access to oil, because that was off the back of President Roosevelt initiating an oil embargo on Japan because of its military expeditionary activities and incursions into China and elsewhere. So that energy security thing is something that drives a lot of their approach to security policy in general, and their absolute fanatical approach to being in a position where they can never be pressured or be vulnerable for a lack of that energy that is helping to drive this economic miracle of the position they've achieved in the world now. So those are a short summary of the dynamics. All of these things are worthy of much deeper study and commentary, and we'll certainly do that as we go along. So hopefully we'll see. We all believed that they were going to be on a steady trajectory off the back of Zhou Enlai and Xi Jinping, and we were hoping Deng Xiaoping, and we were hoping that we would increase and build on that student contact and tourism. They were even beginning to experiment with village democracy in China before Xi Jinping reversed all of the gears on this. And we were seeing the success of the one state, two systems process in Hong Kong, all of that being undone by the severe repression that followed. And that repression sending a really strong message to Taiwan that, obviously that is something to be avoided at all costs. You could never trust the mainland to preserve the system that we have in place and our freedoms. Look at what has happened to Hong Kong. So, we'll go down swinging rather than, reintegrate with the mainland. So it's a real shame that happened. We could have, if we were patient and the Chinese maintained that trajectory, helped and engaged to build that relationship that encouraged the attitude of reintegrating Taiwan through a peaceful process where their freedoms were preserved. We have to abandon all hope of that now. But perhaps we can approach conversations with China in relation to, through renewable energies and alternative energies, to addressing their energy paranoia and perhaps getting to relax on that front, but also forcing them to understand that their power comes from international trade, from the relationships that have been built through that and the investment that's flowed from it, and that anything that they do that undermines that stability and global order and international trade is going to hurt them as much as it will hurt anybody else. So that's the types of conversations we'll have to have, but it's very difficult to really see how that can happen in the context of Xi Jinping, who then takes over as General Secretary of the CCP in 2012 and is elected president on the 14th of March 2013 and begins that systematic process of dismantling all of the sureties and ambitions and hopes and optimism that we might have had up to that point, and China becomes a full-throated dictatorship. So we'll call it quits there, and the next time we talk about China, we'll try and unpack more deeply the background of Xi Jinping and an understanding of the man, the person, because we are dealing with now the mental attitude of one person as to what we have to deal with, how we have to manage it in relation to our situation and China and the peace and prosperity of the region. So thanks very much for being with me, and I look forward to talking with you next time. Cheers.